Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Testing, 1, 2, 3. All righty then. Might as well start. Welcome to This and That Information, 5 November. We're looking at today at Dussel on Enrique Dussel on Marx's Economic Manuscripts of 1861 to 63, Chapter 8. Last time we looked at 7 and Chapter 8 is on surplus value, profit, accumulation, and crisis in Ricardo. Surplus value, profit, accumulation, and crisis in Ricardo, notebooks 12 and 13, pages 636 to 752, between August and September of 1862. Quote, Marx, when speaking of the destruction of capital through crises, one must distinguish two factors. Insofar as the reproduction process is checked and the labor process is restricted, or in some instances is completely stopped, real capital is destroyed. Machinery which is not used is not capital. Labor which is not exploited is equivalent to lost production. Raw material which lies unused is no capital. Buildings, also newly built machinery, which are either unused or remain unfinished, commodities which rot in warehouses, all this is destruction of capital. All this means that the process of reproduction is checked and that the existing means of production are not really used as means of production, are not put into operation. Thus, their use value and their exchange value go to the devil. Secondly, however, the destruction of capital through crises means the depreciation of values, which prevents them from later renewing their reproduction process as capital on the same scale. Close quote. Now, in this chapter, we shall return to the subject abandoned in section 5.2, where Marx studied the question of the surplus value in Smith. This shows that these books are not a history and not even theories of surplus value. They are critical confrontations around the subject of surplus value, and sometimes the distance from this subject is very far. Now we explicitly analyze Ricardo's theory, but here, from a much more complex categorical perspective than in the beginning. 8.1, surplus value and profit. When dealing with the question of profit and wages, Ricardo never paid attention to constant capital, the fourth part that Smith also ignored. Remember section 5.3, quote, to this extent, therefore, he considers surplus value and not profit. Hence, it is possible to speak of his theory of surplus value. On the other hand, however, he thinks that he's dealing with profit as such, and in fact, views which are based on the assumption of profit and not of surplus value constantly creep in. Where he correctly sets forth the laws of surplus value, he distorts them by immediately expressing them as laws of profit. On the other hand, he seeks to present the laws of profit directly without the immediate links as laws of surplus value. All these confusions follow from the fact that nowhere does Ricardo consider surplus value separately and independently from its particular form, that is, profit and profits, bracket, interests, and rent. Hence his confusion of value with cost price, his wrong theory of rent, his erroneous laws relating to the causes of the rise and the fall in the rate of profit, etc. To speak about surplus value in Ricardo is really to talk about profit, and only guesses casually when the invested capital is only variable capital, because in this case, surplus value and profit are identical because they express the relationship of wages and not paid surplus labor. Marx analyzes two questions: the aforementioned confusion between surplus value, profit, and rent, and the question of the surplus value in itself. Concerning the relationship of surplus value to profit, the whole problem lies in having ignored the constant capital. For this reason, he furthermore overlooks the fact that the rate of, quote, furthermore overlooks the fact that the rate of profit depends on the amount of surplus value and by no means on the rate of surplus value. The amount of surplus value depends on the organic composition of the capital. All this, in principle, Marx had already discovered in the Grundrisse. Surplus value, we already know, is determined by the relationship established between the necessary working time and the not paid surplus time labor, that is, the variable capital and the surplus labor relationship. Profit, on the other hand, depends on the relationship between the total quantity of labor employed, which includes constant capital, that is, this total quantity by the relationship between the total quantity of labor by the capital of the whole class of capitalists and on the proportional quantity of unpaid labor employed. Because Ricardo does not consider constant capital nor distinguish between surplus value and profit, he must necessarily fall into conclusion. By the same token, he's not able to comprehend the variation of the rate of profit as distinguished from variations in the rate of surplus value. For example, quote, but assuming a given surplus value, an increase of the price of the raw produce from the surface of the earth would raise the value of constant capital to variable and therefore reduce the rate of profit, thus raising the rent. Close quote. But if, for example, wages rose at the same time as constant capital without a change in the organic composition, in that case, the total mass of surplus value remained unchanged, then surplus value and the rate of profit would have to decrease. If surplus value increased at the same rate as wages, then both rates would remain the same. Now, there could also be the case in which the proportion of constant capital decreases that would increase the rate of profit with the rate of surplus value remaining the same. All this is illustrated by Marx in his tables of numerical examples. By the same token, Ricardo necessarily has to confuse commodity value, which is determined by labor, and cost price, which is determined by market condition. See sections 7.2 and 7.4. In these pages, the discussion is about the value of the commodity, the VC of figure 7.3, and not about market value, MC, in that same figure. Because Ricardo does not distinguish correctly between surplus value and profit, and because does not correctly define rent, the confusion he has when comparing the general rate of profit and the absolute rent rate is unavoidable. Now, it should be emphasized, exerting epistemological attention, that Marx again uses the term price of production in reference to the concept, as he will use it in Capital on 4 occasions. But perhaps using the concept of production cost, lines below, influenced him to go back to the denomination that had been using since the moment, that is, till that moment, cost price. Now, regarding surplus value as such, Marx re-examines questions already clarified in his previous investigations. Quote, thus, the value close quote. Marx returns to his distinction between living labor and labor capacity, wages, pay, labor capacity, and not living labor, which has no value as land, for example. And because of that, objectified labor in the product might be greater than the past objectified labor in wages. Now, quote, instead of labor, Ricardo should have discussed labor capacity. Capital would at once have been revealed as a definite social relationship. Ricardo thus only distinguishes capital as accumulated labor from immediate labor. And it is something purely physical, only an element in the labor process from which the relation between the worker and capital, wages, and profit could never be developed, quote, close quote. Ricardo only discovered relative surplus value, only materially, not formally, as in the question of rent. He did not discover absolute surplus value, as he also did not discover absolute rent, because, in fact, the origin of surplus value does not become clear, because thus the origin and nature of surplus value is not clearly comprehended. The surplus labor plus the necessary labor. In short, the total working day is regarded as a fixed magnitude, and the productivity of capital, the compulsion to perform surplus labor, are not recognized. And therefore, the historical justification for capital is not set forth. Subsection 8.2, the rate of profit. Now, Marx advances into results reached after the Grundrisse, because, in fact, in the previous section, the categories constructed in these manuscripts of 1861 to 63 were not used. Quote, now, Ricardo wrongly identifies surplus value with profit. Ricardo evidently shares Smith's view that the total value of the annual product resolves itself into revenues, hence also his confusion of value with cost price. To speak of value and cost price was not possible in the notebooks of 1857 to 58. Now, in 61, 63, it is methodologically possible. And referring to the method, because Ricardo did not have the theoretical immediate links or those necessary categories of mediation, footnote 2, in reference to the general law of value, he could not achieve convincing results. Quote, now, Ricardo commits all these blunders because he attempts to carry through his identification of the rate of surplus value with the rate of profit by means of forced abstraction. Ricardo does not carry true abstract thinking far enough and is therefore driven into false abstraction, close quote. On the contrary, the laws of the rate of profit are, firstly, we have seen that the rate of profit can, quote, firstly, we have seen that the rate of profit can fall or rise as a result of a fall or rise in rent, independently of any change in the value of labor. Secondly, the absolute amount of profit equals the absolute amount of surplus value. The same amount of profit is therefore possible with a falling rate of surplus value and a rising number of workers and vice versa, close quote. The third is the fundamental law of the rate of profit. The fourth and fifth that Marx discusses are not as important. The truth that our critique shows that, although Ricardo started from the identity of surplus value and profit, in fact, they are distinguished and even opposed in some cases or examples. Ricardo never understood clearly that the rate of profit, that is surplus value, total value, small s over big C, is not equal to the rate of surplus value. Surplus value is variable capital, small s over small v. For that, he refers to absolute profit and profit rate that might vary in unequal proportions. Quote, Ricardo distinguishes between absolute profits, which equals surplus value, and rate of profits, and shows that the rate of profit falls more as a result of the change in the value of the capital advance than the absolute profits, the surplus value, fall as a result of the rise in the value of labor. In the passages, Ricardo himself throws overboard his whole theory of profit, which is based on the false identification of the rate of surplus value with the rate of profit. But the identification of surplus value and profit produces more ambiguity in the question of the formation, the Bildung, the formation of the general rate of profit. According to Marx, quote, now it is evident that the emergence, realization, creation of the general rate of profit necessitates the transformation of values into cost price that are different from these values. Ricardo, on the contrary, assumes the identity of values and cost prices. He assumes this rate of profit as something pre-existent, which therefore even plays a part in his determination of value, close quote. Now, this point is very important to Marx. In bourgeois political economy, including Ricardo's, it is from circulation, from supply and demand that are formed or constituted price, average profit rate, the cost price, that is the natural price, and even the commodity value, which is identified with cost price. Now, Marx, on the contrary, needs to create new categories in order to distinguish the confused, the falsely identified. Now, if it is true that competition levels prices and even market value, that is not the commodity value, remember section 7.4, figure 7.3. In some cases of special exchanges, such as in agriculture, it might be true that the cost price is less than the market price, and that, however, the latter expresses the real value. Quote, if competition makes their market value conform to their value, then the level is established, close quote. Marx can then distinguish between the general rate of surplus value, which is constituted by the average proportion between unpaid labor and paid labor, and which enters into the average value of a branch of commodities, and the general rate of profit, which is established instead by the relationship between the amount of living labor employed in relation to accumulated labor. if the composition of capital in this branch is far below the average composition, which determines the average profit, the relations of supply and demand in this new branch may make it possible to sell its output above its cost price. The surplus value is page 70. The surplus value is determined at the level of production, that is the necessary time plus the surplus time, and determines the commodity's average value. Profit is determined at the level of circulation, end of the market, because the cost price, as Marx denominates it here, are the advances or expenses previous to production, that is big C, small c, plus big C, small v, plus the average profit that is determined by market competition. In the totality of the system, surplus value and average profit must be equal. But between nations, branches, or special spheres within the individual capital, surplus value might be distributed in such a way that it is greater or less than the average profit. With that, Marx has discovered the lost link between value and cost price, or natural price, according to Ricardo. The lost link between value and cost price. Both might be different without destroying the law of value. That is, the continuity can be seen between the worker's human being, that is, his living labor, labor capacity, wages, surplus value, as the robbery of human life, and the average profit as a certain distribution of this stolen human life. Cost price determination and even market price that can be greater than the cost price, and that, however, expresses only the value of the commodity, that also contains an average that distributes the surplus value. Now, this means, if you can follow that, that Marx can measure ethically or from human labor the totality of categories and the capitalist economic reality, and therefore can make an ethical critique of it. That is, if by ethical is understood correctly, the critique of the dominant and established structure of capitalism. Because we are in a general consideration of capital as such, the colonial question does not enter into the matter. Not the type of competition, that is center periphery, that will be analyzed later. But it is not denied, not at all, that one has to systematically study it later at a more concrete and complex level. As in many other questions, Ricardo materially guesses right when he suggests that there exists a diminishing rate of profit. But because of all his confusions already indicated, he could never find the causes of this law. Footnote 3. Marx begins his critique by articulating the difference between Adam Smith and Ricardo. Quote, Adam Smith says that the value of profit falls with the accumulation of capital because of the growing competition between the capitalists. Ricardo says that it does so because of the growing deterioration of agriculture, that is, the increased price of necessaries, close quote. Now, Marx is concerned very little with Smith because his arguments are weak, since he wants to justify the lowering of prices and of the profit as well in order to reduce the arbitrary profits, which does not suppose a real decrease in the rate of profit from the reduction of the surplus value in relation to the total invested capital. Ricardo instead shows that competition can level the rate of profit, but not reduce it. Ricardo can only argue that, given a constant working day, the rate of profit rate decreases because the rate of surplus value decreases. This rate of the surplus value, that is, the necessary time and surplus time relationship, the rate of the surplus value could decrease if the necessary time increases. This would be possible. The value of the means of subsistence on which the worker spends his wages rises. That is, quote, now this happens because agriculture is becoming less productive. The continuous fall in industrial profit is thus bound up with a continuous rise in the rate of rent. I've already shown that Ricardo's view of rent is wrong. The rate of profit falls, although the rate of surplus value remains the same or even rises because the proportion of variable capital to constant capital decreases with the development of the productive power of labor. The rate of profit thus falls not because labor becomes less productive, but because it becomes more productive. Close quote. Immediately, Marx undertakes an analysis starting from clearly specified examples in comparative tables in which theoretical comparison appears in the differences, that is, comparative tables, in order to show the error in Ricardo's argument that increasing rent causes the rate of profit to fall. Following Marx's argument step by step would take us far away. In any case, Marx separates the rent question as a direct factor in causing the rate of profit to decline, and as an objection shows an example in which the profit rate rose, despite the rising corn prices due to diverse concrete factors, of course. For Marx, the question of the falling rate of profit should be situated at the level of the technical composition of the capital or the technological proportion between the amount of accumulated labor and living labor. On the other hand, since surplus value can be distributed in a different way between the industrial profit P, big P, interest I, big I, and rent, big R, the profit rate might decrease. Although, for example, the industrial profit rises in proportion to interest or the reverse. And Marx continues, quote, the reciprocal rise of P prime, I, and R only represents an altered distribution of P among different persons. A further examination of the circumstances on which this distribution of P falls, or depends, on which this distribution of P depends, but which does not coincide with a rise or fall of P itself, does not belong here, but in a consideration of the competition between capitals. Close quote. Marx remembers, then, that we are only at the first of 4 parts of his treatise on capital in general. Competition would be the subject of the second part and shall not be treated here. Subsection 8.3, accumulation and reproduction. After considering profit, continuing the logical discourse, it is necessary to consider the moment in which profit returns is reflected back onto the existing capital. Footnote 5. In this case, accumulation and reproduction might materially coincide, but not formally. Quote, the general law is as follows, where part of a product and therefore also the surplus produce, i.e. the use value in which the surplus value is expressed, can re-enter as a condition of production, as instrument of labor or material of labor, into the sphere of production is as a condition of reproduction reincorporated into the process directly, so that accumulation and reproduction on a larger scale coincide here directly. Now, they must coincide everywhere, but not in this direct manner, close quote. Accumulation is the conversion of profit into capital globally in a formal way, just by the return, really as an effective increase of capital. Reproduction, instead, is formally and in a simple way the conservation of what is not consumed or the mere repurchase of the conditions of production, essentially the constant capital that is consumed, but even variable capital that has to be employed again. However, really, or in reality, it can be expanded reproduction as an increase of productive capital and its articulation with other complementary capitals. First of all, then, is pure conservation. Quote, above all, it is necessary to have a clear understanding of the reproduction of constant capital. We are considering the annual reproduction here, taking the year as the time measure of the process of reproduction. A large part of the constant capital is not consumed and therefore does not need to be reproduced. It will be its purely formal reproduction or preservation. Close quote. But there's another part of the constant capital that is used, as are all use values, and at the same time is still related to other capitals. Quote, a second part of the constant capital is consumed annually in the production of commodities and there must therefore also be reproduced. This includes the whole of that part of fixed capital which enters annually into the valorization process, as well as the whole of that part of constant capital which consists of circulating capital. And as constant capital, they're all consumed during the year, whether only their value enters into the commodity, as in the case of fixed capital, or their use value too, as with circulating capital, close quote. So, in this way, expanded reproduction in capital in general interests Marx not only as a capital, but as all capitals globally. Now, on the other hand, the realized profit or surplus value is globally accumulated in capital as surplus capital. But as a reproduction process, it is distributed among the capitals proportionally to the given organic composition of the capital. Quote, the accumulation of new capital can therefore proceed only under the same conditions as the reproduction of already existing capital, close quote. So, if there is more constant capital than variable capital, and when increasing productivity, we shall see in the issue of crisis, the constant capital always increases more, then a greater proportion of it would accumulate as new constant capital, which would produce a falling profit rate, as we have seen. Marx returns here to state the question of expanded reproduction in connection with other capitals at the level of production and means of production. There remains, quote, there remains the question, can a part of the surplus produce be retransformed into capital, that is, constant capital, through an intermediary exchange between the producer, for example, of machinery, implements of labor, etc., and the producer of raw material, iron, coal, metals, timber, etc. That is, through the exchange of various components of constant capital, they replace or form new constant capital through this exchange of the reciprocal component parts of their constant capital, close quote. Now, Marx had already treated this problem in his critique of Smith. However, in subsets footnote 6, however, accumulation and reproduction will still have difficulties. Crisis manifests these contradictions. as we will examine in the following section. Further, Marx discussed different kinds of accumulation and their economic consequences. Following in that order, numerous quotes taken from Ricardo's Principles, from chapters 5, twice, 6, twice, 7, 8, 9, 20, 22, twice, 26, and 32, all from Ricardo's Principles. And because Ricardo thinks that accumulation involves increasing variable capital only and does not consider the reproduction of fixed capital, neither can he understand that, quote, accumulation for its part is not determined directly by the rate of surplus value, but by the ratio of surplus value to the total amount of the capital advanced, that is, by the rate of profit, close quote. About the preceding, Marx indicates that for Ricardo, accumulation has the tendency to check accumulation, and the law of the falling rate of profit, since agriculture becomes relatively less productive as industry develops, hangs ominously over bourgeois production, close quote. At any rate, and finally, accumulation is the ultimate objective of capital. It is the constant aim of capitalist production to produce a maximum of surplus value or surplus product with the minimum capital outlay. In this conception, the workers themselves appear as that which they are in capitalist production, mere means of production, not an end to in themselves, and not the aim of production, certainly. Close quote. Now, this is an evident ethical reference to Kant's formulation of not placing the person as a means, but as an end in itself. The Mittel versus the Selbstzweck. Selbstzweck. Subsection 8.4, the possibility and the existence of crisis. This is perhaps within these folios of Notebook 13, the part of these manuscripts most filled with unexpected philosophical, economic, and historical consequences. The issue of devalorization in Grundrisse is now, footnote 7, is now the question of the possibility, the Möglichkeit, footnote 8, of crisis, the question of the possibility of crisis, which is not, it should be said, the question of the reality, the Wirklichkeit of crises. Quote, now the further development, the Entwicklung of the potential crisis, potentia crisis, has to be traced. The real crisis can only be deduced from the real movement of capitalist production, competition, and credit, close quote. Quote, the general crisis comes into being. This is nothing other than the possibility of crisis through which the possibility can develop into reality, the Wirklichkeit, close quote. Quote, the general abstract possibility of crisis denotes no more than the most abstract form of crisis without content, without a compelling motivating factor. The transition from one to the other, however, proceed smoothly. The most abstract form of crisis, and therefore the formal possibility of crisis, is thus the metamorphosis of the commodity itself. Close quote, footnote 9. In these pages, Marx uses repeatedly the concepts of possibility, contingency, and condition. Footnotes 10 and 11. We are exactly situated in a central point of the Hegelian ontology. that is in the passage from the essence, footnote 12, as a mere possibility, abstract potency to the reality of being. Footnote 13, the Dasein as real. Marx is situated at the abstract level of the essence as a possibility that is capital in general, and leaves for the future, part 2, that is competition, parts 3 and 4, credit and stock capital, the more concrete, real, complex parts of the projected work. One has to bear in mind that Marx chooses from Latin the word realization, footnote 14, realization, for the transformation of commodities into money in abstraction or in general as yet, and uses the word reality, the Wirklichkeit, in the strict Hegelian sense for the most concrete moment of the passage from the mere possibility to the real existence after even volume 3 of Capital, the book. In the same manner as the crisis, and as one of its conclusions, the dependency between national capitals of different levels of development might be treated in its possibility or essence, that is the logical order, or in its real existence, historical or concrete existence, which has frequently been wrong done in the first place. But first, when Marx criticized Ricardo's ingenuous doctrine about profit, that the commodity is not always realized, he established the question of overproduction. But Ricardo is quite wrong when he seeks to refute Adam Smith by asserting that overproduction in one country is impossible. Overproduction does not call forth a lasting fall in profit, but it is lastingly periodic. It is followed by periods of underproduction, etc. Overproduction arises precisely from the fact that the mass of the people, the Volk, can never consume more than the average quantity of necessaries, that their consumption, therefore, does not grow correspondingly with the productivity of labor, close quote. Now, if there is no coincidence, but rather contradiction and inequalities between production and consumption, already there lies the possibility of crisis. It presupposes the constant disproportion between increasing production, because the increasing accumulation of constant capital, and the decreasing possibility of using workers, because the necessary time diminishes, less wages and fewer buyers, and less consumption, which disposes of the liberal dogma of the metaphysical equilibrium of sellers and buyers. And this led to the conclusion that demand is determined only by production, or also that demand and offer are identical. Now, once the distribution between production and solvent necessities, footnote 15, is presupposed, the question can be formulated like that of the text cited at the beginning of this chapter, which we recommend should be reread now or in the following formulation. Quote, overproduction is specifically conditioned by the general law of the production of capital. We produce to the limit set by the productive forces, that is to say, to exploit the maximum amount of labor with the given amount of capital, without any consideration for the actual limits of the market or the needs backed by the ability to pay. And this is carried out through continuous expansion of reproduction and accumulation, and therefore constant reconversion of revenue into capital. While on the other hand, the mass of the producers remain tied to the average level of needs and must remain tied to it according to the nature of capitalist production, close quote. In fact, and lastly, Ricardo's mistake is the following. Accordingly, or originally, he starts on the assumption that every accumulation of capital is the same as, equals, an increase in variable capital, that the demand for labor therefore increases directly in the same proportion as the capital is accumulated. Marx concludes, quote, but this is wrong, since with the accumulation of capital, a change takes place in its organic composition, and the constant part of the capital grows at a faster rate than the variable, close quote. This is the entire problem. When diminishing the necessary time of the wages in proportion to increasing the production overproduction, one falls into unsalability, that is, the impossibility of making the passage from commodity to money, that is, to make the sale, the C-M. This lack of equilibrium between the increase in production and the stagnation of consumption is not solved with the natural growth of the population, as Rosa Luxemburg supposed, that because although there is a great population, it is necessary that they be solvent, that is, they have money, that is, wages. Overproduction, plethora, or capital abundance, growing accumulation, or expanded reproduction, surplus value realization as surplus capital are diverse phenomena of the unity of differences which are forcibly destroyed. That is, use value over exchange value, commodity over money, buying over selling, producing over consuming, etc. The one who produces cannot choose between selling or not selling. It is necessary that he sells, and what occurs in the crisis is precisely that he cannot sell or can only do so below the cost price, or it may even sell at a positive loss. If the commodity is not realized as money, there is an annihilation or destruction of capital, devalorization, crisis. The crisis is precisely the phase of disturbance and interruption of the process of reproduction. And this can always happen because of the lack of identity of production and consumption. What, after all, quote, what, after all, has overproduction to do with absolute needs? It is only concerned with demand that is backed by the ability to pay. It is not a question of absolute overproduction as such in relation to the absolute need or the desire to possess commodities. Indeed, close quote, indeed, an essential moment of the crisis possibility is the non-identity between the absolute need to be hungry or to wish for bread and to have money to be solvent. Need and need with money are not the same. This is an absolute limit of capital with respect to the third world at the end of the 20th century. Needy multitudes, but not solvent. Without money, because they are unemployed or semi-employed, badly paid with miserable wages, miserable paupers. A system would be just only when it equalized absolute needs with absolute production, when full employment, that is wages with money, satisfied the solvent needs with existing products by increasing production, by the inexistence of relative overproduction. Now, only in this sense is there neither partial nor general overproduction, and the one is not opposed to the other. It would be an equilibrium economy of full employment and the increase of social production. Communal, that is socialism. There can be overproduction in the third world as economies for exploitation because there are massive unsatisfied needs of the majority of the population. Therefore, we can conclude, quote, the possibility of crisis, we can only say that in this form itself lies the possibility of the rupture and separation of essentially complementary phases, close quote. Crisis, then, is any deterioration, interruption, or unrealization of the passage of value form from one essential determination of capital to another. In the metamorphosis of the commodity or of value, there is crisis when the essential mobility of capital as a whole is fixed in a moment without the necessary passage to the next moment. The later phase is negated and annihilates itself. Quote, the circulation process as a whole of the reproduction process of capital as a whole is the unity of its production phase and its circulation phase. Therein lies a fully developed possibility or abstract form of crisis. Close quote. Footnote 16. Marx then studies the diverse forms of the crisis in the metamorphosis of capital. There are first two possibilities of crisis in the two functions of money. Now, I don't know if I should continue to finish this off. Yes, I can finish this off. Marx then studies the diverse forms of the crisis in the metamorphosis of capital. There are first two possibilities of crisis in the two functions of money. Quote, the general possibility of crisis is given in the process of metamorphosis of capital itself, and in two ways. Insofar as money functions as means of circulation, there's the separation of purchase and sale. And insofar as money functions as means of payment, it has two different aspects. It acts as measure of value and realization of value, close quote. In the first case, the commodity is unsaleable. The second is not about the unsaleability of the commodity, but about the non-realization of a whole series of payments based on the sale in a determinate amount of time. That is a monetary crisis. Likewise, the crisis is possible when there are produced price changes or price revolutions. In any case, the general conditions of the crisis must be distinguished from its forms. One of the foregoing conditions might be the reconversion of money into productive capital of the profit accumulation or reproduction. If the prices of raw materials rise, for example, reproduction cannot be repeated on the same scale. Crisis. Marx analyzes a few cases, such as this one, of inadequacies or disproportions that oppose the identity of all the moments of capital with itself and with the market and other capitals. In any case, Marx returns to the essential contradiction of the crisis. Quote, thus, nothing is more absurd as a means of denying crises than the assertion that the consumers, the buyers and producers, the consumers and producers, buyers and sellers, are identical in capitalist production. In order to deny crises, they assert unity where there is conflict and contradiction, close quote. At the bottom, the argument is articulated like this, quote, the mere relationship of wage laborer and capitalist implies that the majority of the producers, that is the workers, are non-consumers, not buyers of a very large part of their product. They must always be overproducers, produce above and over their needs, close quote. In other words, by producing a surplus product over his necessary time, the time necessary to reproduce his wage, his labor capacity, that is, in order to be buyer or consumer of what he needs to live, the worker cannot buy all the surplus product produced. The profit or overproduction, that is surplus value, is the same. Disproportionate production, says Marx. From here is also derived the non-identity of the extension of production and the market, i.e., the market expands slower than production. Returning once again to the disproportion between production in its unstoppable development and the limited consumption, Marx makes an important distinction. Quote, the word overproduction is itself an error, so long as the most urgent needs of a large part of society are not satisfied, or only the most immediate needs are satisfied. There can be, of course, absolutely no talk of an overproduction of product. On the contrary, it must be said that on the basis of capitalist production, there is constant underproduction in this sense. But overproduction of products and overproductions of commodities are two entirely different things, close quote. Products satisfy human needs, even though the subject of need may not have money, for example, in a utopian community, nor necessarily with money in a socialist society. The commodity must be exchanged for money. If the needy person does not have money, he cannot be a consumer because he is not a solvent needy. For Ricardo and capitalist consumption, and for Ricardo and capitalist economists in general, the overproduction of commodities is denied, but the overproduction of capital is admitted, because they admit that surplus value or profit, the more money is produced as unsaleable surplus product. By the same token, in analyzing the question of machinery, where Ricardo was inspired by John Barton, the author of The Observations on the Circumstances Which Influence the Condition of the Labor and Classes of Society of 1817, Marx shows that the incorporation of better means of production in order to increase the productivity of labor constitutes a crisis factor because it increases the disproportion between production and consumption. In the machine, less labor is objectified than it displaces. But the machine not only displaces labor, but also annihilates capital. Quote, the mechanized loom originally replaced the hand loom weaver. In this case, not only is the laborer displaced, but his instrument of production, too, ceases to be capital in the Ricardian sense. The entire or complete devaluation of the old capital. It is ridiculous to say, in this case, that the old capital continues to make the same demand on labor as before, close quote. In other words, by producing a surplus product over his necessary time, the time necessary to reproduce his wage, his labor capacity, that is, in order to be buyer or consumer of what he needs to live, the worker cannot buy all the surplus product produced. The profit or overproduction, that is surplus value, is the same. That is disproportionate production, says Marx. From here is also derived the non-identity of the extension of production and the market, i.e., the market expands slower than production. Returning once again to the disproportion between production in its unstoppable development and the limited consumption, Marx makes an important distinction. Quote, the word overproduction is itself an error. So long as the most urgent needs of a large part of society are not satisfied, or only the most immediate needs are satisfied, there can be, of course, absolutely no talk of an overproduction of product. On the contrary, it must be said that on the basis of capitalist production, there is constant underproduction in this sense. But overproduction of products and overproduction of commodities are two entirely different things, close quote. Products satisfy human needs, even though the subject of need may not have money, for example, in a utopian community, nor necessarily with money in a socialist society. The commodity must be exchanged for money. If the needy person does not have money, he cannot be a consumer because he is not a solvent needy. For Ricardo and capitalist economists in general, the overproduction of commodities is denied, but the overproduction of capital is admitted. This question, like all the previous ones, is very important for theory of dependency because incorporation of more developed technology on the part of the more advanced capital of the central countries annihilates underdeveloped capital. Barton has great merit regarding the matter of overproduction, such a reality in Latin America. Smith thought that population increases along with capital. Barton, on the other hand, says that demand for labor does not grow proportionally with the development of machinery, but that the machines themselves make population redundant, i.e., create surplus population. The demand for labor does not grow proportionally, quote, the demand for labor does not grow proportionally with the development of machinery, but that the machines themselves make population redundant, that is, i.e., create surplus population, unquote. But although Barton, like others, guesses right materially, he does not do so formally. Well, I've gone past my time anyway, so I will stop. Suffice it to say, the text is there for you to consider. So I will stop the live stream.